Hey everybody, and welcome back to Poison Mushroom, the show where I play some of the shittiest games of all time. This week, Jigsaw and I are playing a game of Saw 2 Flesh and Blood. Say what you will about the Saw series of movies, but they're certainly prolific if nothing else. Despite being critically reviled, with not a single one scoring more than 50% on Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic, teens and preteens alike packed the theaters for the franchise's 7 consecutive Halloween openings, establishing the torture porn genre as a dominant, albeit brief force at the box office. The 7 Saw movies have made almost $1 billion worldwide, and it's actually been recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful horror franchise of all time. So naturally there had to be a video game. And this is where things get confusing. I mean, this game is called Saw 2 Flesh and Blood, so one might naturally assume that it's based on the second movie in the series. However, that movie came out in 2005, whereas this game was released 5 years later in 2010 to coincide with the release of Saw 3D. So which is it? Well, it turns out that this is actually called Saw 2 because it's the second game in the Saw franchise. The first one, aptly titled just Saw the Video Game, came out around the same time that Saw 6 opened in theaters, but it actually follows the events of the first movie. Saw 2 Flesh and Blood serves as a bridge between the first and second movies, despite its release half a decade after those films came out. Chronologically confused yet? And as an aside, before we really get into things, this game was developed by Zombie Games, perhaps most well-known nowadays for creating Blackwater, the pseudo-light gun game for Kinect that was widely regarded as the worst game of last year, so that should give you some indication of what we're getting ourselves into here. Initially, we play as Campbell, a drug addict who has to survive Jigsaw's trials in order to see his son again, and the game doesn't waste any time introducing us to Saw's unique brand of particularly teeth-gritting, cringe-inducing torture. Campbell has the key to his trap surgically implanted just below his eye, and to free himself he'll have to cut open his eyelid with a scalpel and dig it out with his bare hands. If he doesn't, a bear trap will snap on his skull, turning him into Campbell jelly. Now, there's no shortage of scenes like these in the movies where a character has to do something particularly icky to survive. In fact, Jigsaw's entire MO is doing shit like this just to force people to appreciate their lives more. But those scenes actually have tension and a certain ooh factor because our primitive ape brains don't instinctively understand the existence of special effects. In other words, although we may logically understand that industrial light and magic exists, when we see Wesley from The Princess Bride slowly cutting his hand off with a rusty saw, it still causes us to have an emotional reaction. Be it disgust or fear or that was fucking awesome! This reaction and the tension leading up to it is essential to the effectiveness of these kind of scenes. And herein lies by far the biggest problem with this game, and that is, for a survival horror game, it's completely devoid of any of that all-important tension. Although it might be gross to watch a guy cut open his eyelid with a scalpel, even though it looks totally cartoony, it's not actually tense because all we're actually doing is holding the A button and moving the left analog stick. There's also no suspense because we know exactly what's gonna happen. He's gonna cut himself open, he's gonna get the key, and he's gonna get out of the room. We know this because it's a video game. It has to happen like this. It's not like he's gonna bleed to death on the floor and then the game is gonna fade to a black screen that just says, "Game over, fuck you and thanks for your money, asshole." So there's no fear on our part because there's no consequences. We know the hero, at the very least, is gonna get out of the room safely, so who cares if he has to cut open a few eyelids on the way? This lack of tension permeates through the entire game and basically destroys it from the inside out. Sometimes while exploring Jigsaw's compound, you'll open a door that'll set off a trap. The way that you avoid the rigged shotgun or the falling sword is just by pressing a series of buttons in a leisurely timed QuickTime event. Provided you're able to hit 2 buttons in succession, this means that there's basically no risk from traps or hazards in the entire game, which means there's no sense of permanent uneasiness that absolutely needs to exist for a survival horror game to be effective. Apart from exploration, there's 2 other basic elements to the game, combat and puzzles, and sadly the combat is arguably the most disappointing part of the entire game. Combat in most survival horror games feels genuinely scary because usually you're playing against the odds. Oftentimes you're not some super soldier hero type, you're just an ordinary person who has to make do with weapons they find in the environment. And this is actually the direction I thought that Saw 2 would take. After all, for the first hour of the game I had no weapons except for my bare fists, so I actually felt like I was in real danger during my first combat encounter with a much larger and much angrier ex-convict wielding a nail bat. Unfortunately, this anxiety pretty much went out the window once I realized that the way you win fights is, again, just a QuickTime event. Where's the excitement in that? The whole point of a survival horror game is to, scare you, but if I know that I can take out any enemies as long as I pay attention and press the buttons on screen at the right times, then I don't feel like a helpless actor in a terrifying world. I feel like I'm playing fucking Dance Dance Revolution. It also begs the question of what the point of having different weapons is. I mean, if I was able to beat a guy with a nail bat easily with my bare hands, why even bother switching to the nail bat? The puzzles are slightly better, but they make the huge mistake of thinking that the player is a bumbling idiot. I mean, admittedly, if you paid full price for a game based on the Saw franchise, then maybe their assumption isn't that far off, but some of the handholding they do is borderline offensive. I mean, take this for example, when they list your primary objective as escape Jigsaw's workshop. No shit, isn't that kind of implicit? Isn't that kind of, I don't know, the whole point of the fucking game? Or how about here? There's no door to get out of this room, but there is a lazily piled stack of cinder blocks doing a really poor job of covering up a pathway. Then you examine it, and the game has the audacity to tell you that it looks weak. I know it looks weak, that's why I fucking examined it! There's also a pipe on the table. In a better game, you'd walk in, see that the wall looks weak without being explicitly told that, pick up the pipe and use the attack button to break it so you can move on. Instead, once you examine the wall, the game basically has huge fuck me text basically shouting at you, "This is the solution to the puzzle!" Or here, at your first quote-unquote boss encounter. I press a button to open an elevator door, and another one of Jigsaw's prisoners starts to come after me. It's clear right away that his only attack is to run straight at me, and since I don't have a weapon, there has to be some kind of environmental way to defeat him. Oh, I know, I'll open the elevator doors so he falls down the shaft and dies. Give it some time, I'm pretty sure that anybody could figure that solution out for themselves, but even if they couldn't, Jigsaw draws a helpful hint in his preamble.
You cannot stand against his strength.
As if that doesn't make it obvious enough, there's a message written above the elevator that hints that you have to get him to drop down the elevator shaft. At this point, why not have Jigsaw say, "Hey man, this guy's gonna attack you, but if you get him to fall down the elevator shaft, it's all good." Fuck that, why even have the puzzle? Why not just have a cutscene where the guy gets off, chases you, and then falls down the elevator shaft? Because when you don't let a player figure things out for themselves, that's pretty much what you're doing already. Or how about this challenge right here?
Each of you have an opportunity to escape this room. The first one to move their cage to the door will be freed. However, there is no prize for second place. You failed, Michael.
What the fuck?
But I'm giving you a second chance.
Remember what I said about the game not having any tension because there's no consequences? What's the incentive to even try if Jigsaw is just gonna let me live anyway? Overall, Saw 2 Flesh and Blood is a perfect example of how not to make a survival horror game. In fact, there's no horror at all because everything dangerous in the game is easily avoided through QuickTime events that are basically impossible to mess up if you've ever played a video game before. If I ever woke up in a dimly lit basement with a bear trap stuck to my dick and a psycho telling me I had to beat this game in 24 hours or the jaws would close, I'd probably at least try, but I'd have to think about it for a while. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up or add it to your favorites, and be sure to check out my channel if you want to see more. In any case, I'll see you guys next week when I play another shitty game.